The Lever. Subscriber-supported journalism that holds power accountable.
From The Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm Arjun Singh. This week in Chicago, Democrats headed into their convention energized. Up until recently, the DNC was looking like a slow march to a political death. But then Biden dropped out, and almost overnight it felt like the political map changed. All of that led to one of the oddest coalitions in American politics being formed. In the same week, convention delegates cheered on AOC and Elizabeth Warren, then one of Uber's top executives, and even a Republican congressman. But one group that was ever present and little seen was corporate America. Throughout the week, viewers tuning into the convention saw several speeches promising to challenge corporate greed and break up monopolies. What the audience didn't see, though, was behind the cameras was a wall of private suites looking out onto the crowd. Suites filled with lobbyists and corporate executives, all hoping to get a seat at the table in a new Harris administration. That stark contrast illustrates the fork in the road Kamala Harris will be at if she wins the presidency. Will she stand with the corporate donors who financed her campaign or the grassroots Democratic base? Today on Lever Time, I'm going to sit down with David Sirota, who spent the last week in Chicago at the DNC. We'll hear what David saw when he went behind the scenes at the convention and whether or not he thinks the Harris administration is serious about pushing forward an economic platform that centers people over corporations.
Welcome, good to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. So we just want to spend some time today talking about the 2024 Senate races, but also the role that we continue to see candidates.
On Wednesday, David Sirota was at a press event held by several Democratic senators.
We're really excited to be joined by Senator Warnock and Senator Cortez Masto, and of course, our chairman, Senator Gary Peters, all former bosses of mine, so hopefully that doesn't get me in trouble. But all of them have...
These senators were some of the Democrats tasked with making sure that the Senate remains in Democratic control in 2025. And on that day, they were laying out their plan for how to do it. Near the end of the event, David Dayen, the executive director of the American Prospect, broached an uncomfortable topic for a lot of senators: whether they'd be willing to do away with the filibuster, a legislative tactic that's now commonly deployed to raise the required number of votes to pass a bill from 51 senators to 60. Here's what Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia had to say in response.
I just want to clarify, because I was in the middle of that fight on the issue of voting rights, which is the most important thing that we didn't get done in 2021. I want to clarify that actually what we were trying to do was to return the filibuster, a real filibuster. The problem that we have now is that the filibuster doesn't cost you anything. I call it a latte filibuster. You can just declare, go down the street, sit down and have a cup of coffee. It doesn't cost you anything. And at the end of the day, on voting rights, we had all 50 Democrats, in fact, on one of those bills, I believe the John Lewis bill, and 48 of us were willing to embrace a filibuster reform proposal that would have exacted pain out of both sides, perhaps tied the Senate up for weeks. But at the end of the day, you could have gotten to a vote. And so it will be interesting to see. I'm certainly deeply interested in the implications of this for getting something done as fundamental as voting rights if we were able to win a trifecta.
What Warnock's saying is that he thinks the filibuster should return to its original form, which required a senator to stand on the floor and actually talk for hours and hours and hours, either forcing 60 of their colleagues to shut them up or wear them down in their opposition to the point that they give up and kill a bill. Today, it's institutionalized, and senators can just say they're filibustering and go on with their day. That's why Warnock called it a latte filibuster, meaning all a senator needs to do is say they're filibustering, and then they're free to walk down to the coffee shop and have a latte or do whatever else they want. After the event, David Sirota caught up with Dayen to hear what he made of Warnock's response.
I understand what he's trying to get at, and his point was basically, you got to mean it if you're going to filibuster. and he called it the current system. What do you call it? A latte filibuster? Yeah, a latte filibuster, where you can just
go across the street and have a latte.
Yeah, exactly. But I also feel like, is that like their attempted middle ground position? Like, we're not going to get rid of the filibuster, but we're going to make people actually stand up and do it?
You know, the history of this is that Jeff Merkley, who's from Oregon, senator, has been the strongest advocate of changing the filibuster, and that's really his program. He calls it the talking filibuster, that you would have to hold the floor, you'd be able to pass off, but only a limited number of times, and at the end you would get a vote. So you can make your point, but you couldn't end it forever. And so I suspect what Warnock's talking about is the plan, the program of the guy who has been associated most with filibuster reform over the years. And Merkley tries to resurrect that every year, and I assume he will. Again, he actually wrote a book at the beginning of the year called Filibustered, which was all about this, and it was actually an incredible book. It's kind of a must-read for nerds. So I think that's what Warnock was talking about. I don't know that it's a middle ground. I mean, obviously, you could just get rid of the thing, and by the way, he's coming right this way.
Here's another thing about the filibuster, too. Let's say Democrats get a full sweep and they control the House, the Senate, and the White House. If they control the Senate, they probably aren't going to win 60 seats. So that means that any legislation or plans Harris is running on and going out and talking about are sure to be filibustered. Unless Senate Democrats agree to get rid of it. Here are the Davids again talking about it.
You know, she gets up in these rallies and says, "I will sign, we will pass the codification of Roe v. Wade. I will sign, we will pass the John Lewis Freedom to Vote Act and the HR 1, the For the People Act. Yeah, For the People Act." She knows that those can't get done without doing something on the filibuster so that a majority of the Senate can pass it. She knows that. And she's saying it out loud to thousands, tens of thousands of people. Is she saying that because she sincerely is going to push to make sure everyone in the Senate goes along with this? Is she saying that because she wants to win an election? Ultimately, we're going to get an answer to all this. We might get an answer after the election, but we're going to get an answer.
I always find, last thing I'll say on this is I always find that the promising to do something and then blaming the filibuster when you are in control of the Senate, and then the political class accepting that rationale. The problem with that is part of doing your job is what I call figuring it out. Right, like it's the politician's job. It's not my job as a reporter, and it's not an activist job. It's the job of like they have one job. They make a promise, and then it's your job to figure out how to make your promise a reality. It's not my job to tell you how to do that. And I think the filibuster is the most clarifying version of this. The filibuster is the problem for the politician who's made the promise. It shouldn't be the problem for the voter demanding the politician fulfill the promise.
Absolutely right. I'll give you an example. When back in the blogger days, when I was working for a state blog in California, California has these very strange laws where you can't pass a tax increase without a 2/3 vote. So literally half of the budget is tax increases or spending cuts. Half of the budget you need a super majority for, and to cut spending you need just a majority. So ultimately it would always be a ratchet down. You would always cut spending if you needed to balance the budget. And we would say, we started this thing, we're like, well, what if we get a 2/3 majority? And I never got more pushback from legislative aides and consultants and things like that than saying we should overcome that hurdle. We should get a 2/3 majority. Like one guy told me, Democrats will get a 2/3 majority when Obama wins Alabama. And by the way, the next year after he said that, Democrats got a 2/3 majority.
Yeah.
And I feel like they were mad about it because they didn't have any excuses left. Like, the 2/3 majority thing was such a great excuse for them. Like, oh, look, the bad Republicans are the ones who are preventing us from making this progress. Now, they have a 2/3 majority. They can't say that anymore, and it pisses them off.
Talking about in California.
In California, they're held accountable. And it's the same thing on the federal level. It's the same thing on the federal level. And so it was very important, actually, that Raphael Warnock and the others got the Senate on the record, Senate Democrats on the record a couple years ago to say, we will carve out the filibuster for this thing. Because that was them figuring it out.
Yes.
They did figure it out. And, it wasn't successful because of Manchin and Sinema, but the mechanism is there. They know that it would work. So now they just got to find the votes to do it.
These wonky details are often the Achilles heel of a presidential campaign. This week, Democrats wanted to throw a party. And they did. You had Lil Jon singing Turn Down for What during Georgia's roll call. Steve Kerr, the coach of the Golden State Warriors, quoting Steph Curry.
And after the results are tallied that night, we can, in the words of the great Steph Curry, we can tell Donald Trump, night, night.
And you saw a range of Democrats taking the stage, jubilantly extolling what they saw as the values of their party. There was AOC.
And I, for one, am tired of hearing about how a two-bit union buster thinks of himself as more of a patriot than the woman who fights every single day to lift working people out from under the boots that breed, trampling.
And of course, Kamala Harris, who offered some vague platitudes about bolstering the middle class.
And we are charting a new way forward to a future with a strong and growing middle class, because we know a strong middle class has always been critical to America's success. And building that middle class will be a defining goal of my presidency.
Watching from afar, it certainly looked like a lot of fun. But call me cynical in wondering if the Democrats' big tent is about to burst. How is it possible, for example, for the party's platform to be both worker-centric and also cater to the corporate interests that were sponsoring much of the convention? One example of this inherent tension came in how the DNC treated Israel's continued bombardment of Gaza. In her speech, Harris tried to strike a balance.
President Biden and I are working to end this war such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination.
But members of the uncommitted movement, people who are trying to leverage the power of withholding their votes to broker a ceasefire, were denied a speaker at the event. And ultimately, they were left in the wilderness of the convention's pageantry. So they emotionally sat outside the convention center, struggling to reconcile their desire for some sort of concrete action in Gaza with the party's refusal to give them a seat at the table.
I'm someone who works within the system, and I was asking a very reasonable ask not to be suppressed. I was asking a very reasonable ask on behalf of our Palestinian siblings not to be suppressed. And the vice president's decision to suppress us is unacceptable. And so I've run out of options from my position as a delegate, and so I'm leaning into my power as a regular, everyday person, and I'm sitting here, and I'm not going anywhere, Roger. I'm not going anywhere.
That's not to say that the speeches and words rang hollow. In fact, the speeches showed a clear shift in Democratic Party politics. The fact that even economically conservative Democrats were talking about tackling corporate power, and that Bernie Sanders received applause for railing against Citizens United, that's significant. But, and there's always this annoying but, how much can we expect to be able to accomplish? And is it possible to really find a balance between these two opposing forces, the power of billionaires and corporations, and the grassroots voters at the core of the Democratic Party? For that, I caught up with David Sirota when he was in Chicago yesterday to help answer these questions. So are you at the Democratic National Convention right now in Chicago?
I'm heading there right now. I'm going to get on the main shuttle up there. I mean, the convention's like incredibly spread out. This is not a completely conducive city to a convention because there's the United Center away from the city, so everyone's, on these giant shuttles, and the security situation's kind of impossible to navigate, and then your credential situation. I kind of feel like this is like Democratic Party policy and governance in miniature. You know how like the Democratic Party is like obsessed with making everything complicated.
Yeah,
and, like,
means testing everything.
Yeah, and means testing everything, and everything has paperwork. I mean, the entire convention feels like it's like a microcosm of that, right? Like if you don't have the right badge, you can't get to the right level, and the more money you have, the better badge you have to get to the right level. It's just like a whole. It
sounds like it's like a fucked up video game.
Yeah, but it's sort of perfect, very on brand for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I mean, what exactly happens at these conventions? Like I saw earlier in the week, they did the kind of cringy floor vote, or the delegates all nominated them, and like Lil Jon walked out and performed Get Low, and it was just this sort of weird thing. So they're nominated now, right? Like what are they going to do now?
I feel like this event and events like this, they now kind of have a feeling of being at one of the Sunday services in the Righteous Gemstones. Mm-hmm. It's incredibly gaudy and incredibly showy, and it's all a giant performance, and it's highly produced. And the reason I use the Righteous Gemstone metaphor for those who've watched that show is there is kind of a religious fervor to what's going on, to the vibe inside of the arena, that it's not really a convention, it's really a rally. It's really kind of a religious ceremony where the outcome is obviously already predetermined. But if you look closely at it, some of the contradictions and disturbing class implications about who really has the power are right there to see in plain sight at a convention like this. I mean, the convention that people are seeing on TV is a television show. The convention that people on the floor of the convention are experiencing is kind of like a feel-good rally. The convention that business groups and lobbying groups and lawmakers are experiencing is actually a business and policy transaction. And by that I mean it's a place where the lobbies that want things from the elected government can get to basically all of the decision makers very quickly and make clear what they want in a time efficient manner because everyone is here.
I mean, and I feel like it's the kind of place where if a bunch of lobbyists show up, or executives from Coca-Cola, for example, no one's going to really question that because they're like, oh, everybody's in town for the big convention. Of course, all the politicians are here. Of course, whoever's there. But like, you've been on the ground. So what have you observed? Like, have you seen that business transaction? Do they hide in secret cloakrooms and, it's all very cloak and dagger about it? Like, how does that play out?
Well, inside the convention center, there is a special floor, the club level floor. Remember, it's an arena. It's a sporting arena.
It's the home of the Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls.
Right. So there's a club level, which if you've gone to a basketball game at one of these arenas, the club level is one of the elite levels. And it's the same thing for a convention. You need to have a special pass because different lobbies, different corporate groups pay lots of money to get themselves suites at the convention, just like they get themselves suites at, let's say, a Bulls game. So that level, the club level, is essentially off limits to the general public, the delegates, the press, et cetera, et cetera. Now, some pictures have leaked out about what you see on that club level outside of the suites, which is that the lobbies that are trying to influence the politicians who are here, they're very open about being here. It's incredibly normalized. It's the Democratic Lieutenant Governors Association, their suite is sponsored in part by Philip Morris, right? I mean, that's
Oh my
right.
God.
That's right on the sign of the Democratic Lieutenant Governors Association. I was in the underground of the arena where they let the guests onto the podium. I managed to get a floor pass and get myself back there. The Democratic cloakroom, which is basically the waiting room, the green room, was sponsored by Microsoft, right? It
Oh
just
my
says it's
God.
sponsored by Microsoft. Now, the question comes up, well, what does that mean, right? What does it mean? What is Microsoft getting from that? Well, it's not like inside the cloakroom, Microsoft lobbyists are necessarily bending the ear of lawmakers, although presumably some of that is going on. It's also letting lawmakers, the political class, the operatives in the political class know who's really calling the shots, who's really the sponsors of the Democratic Party.
Which is really funny to actually hear you say that, because this is coming not too long after Reid Hoffman, a Microsoft board member, was basically calling for Kamala Harris, who he's a massive donor to fire Lena Khan. And there is this whole rigmarole of, oh no, don't take that seriously, whatever. I'm talking as an expert, not a donor. And then here you have, as Harris is batting away those accusations, a company that was at one point a target of an anti-monopoly lawsuit is sponsoring ostensibly the candidate who is claiming, no, I am in favor of all this antitrust stuff. No, I am a fighter. What did AOC say earlier in the week? That Kamala Harris fights every single day for working people while being right above the Microsoft cloakroom.
Exactly. Like that's the hypocrisy there. Although, to be clear, I think that it's almost the other way to look at it is that it's almost honest in how the Democratic Party admits that it looks at the world in which it wants to govern in this way. That presumably the party leaders who set up conventions like this don't see a conflict between politicians promising to regulate industries sponsoring the convention in which those political promises are made, business funding the convention, labor also funding part of the convention. The Democratic Party, I've said this before, I will say it again, it is a party that fundamentally wants to pretend that it never really has to make a choice between the working class and the donor class. And in some ways, you could argue that can be true on some specific policies. I think that if you look at the Venn diagram of policies that the working class, the middle class, that the people want, you put that in one of the circles on the Venn diagram. Then you take the policies that don't offend the donor class, the corporate class, the billionaire class. That's another circle. And then you mix them, you get a lot of the policies that the Democrats talk most about. For instance, reproductive rights, right? Reproductive rights has obviously mass popular appeal, rightly so, and doesn't offend the corporate interests who are buying the suites at the Democratic National Convention, right? That doesn't threaten them. Where it gets dicier, though, is like an event that I went to last night, where it was an event, it was for a series of PACs.
Sure.
That's to honor, that's how they put it, to honor or support the House leadership of the Democrats. And the placard said it was a bunch of climate groups, for instance, Solar Power Energy Industry Association, a bunch of, again, climate advocacy groups, but then also a Save Crypto group. There was also Reynolds Tobacco. There was also the a consortium of fossil fuel companies, the American Gas Association, the American Gas Association, the American Clean Power Association, which is basically a natural gas adjacent group, the American Nuclear Association, right? So
what?
When you think about that, you're like, I'm at a DNC after party. And the funniest part is it's funded by all these groups, and it's, the modicum was to celebrate the power of voters. right? I mean, it doesn't feel like that's celebrating the power of voters. It
Hey,
feels
as
like
Mitt
that's
Romney
celebrating.
said, corporations are people too.
Oh, okay, I guess that's right. Okay. But the point is that at one level, it's like, how can all these groups be under the same umbrella? Like, how can the Solar Energy Industry Association and clean power groups and climate groups be sponsoring the same event as the crypto group and as fossil fuel groups? But I think, again, it goes back to this idea that the Democratic Party pretends there is a world that doesn't need to make choices between any of these entities. And of course, we know that you have to make choices. Reality means you have to make choices. You're either going to reduce carbon emissions and end fossil fuel as the major source of power in the world and save the climate, or your climate is going to burn. Like, that's just science. But I think the Democratic Party doesn't want to acknowledge that, because the Democratic Party as a party wants to raise money from all of them. They want to maximize where they can raise money from.
When you wake up in the morning and see the recent headlines about the Supreme Court,
a judicial decision sparking a political eruption,
I'm guessing you feel overwhelmed and bewildered.
The Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade.
Well, it's terrifying. I don't know what's next.
You hear about the court helping corporations trample your long-standing rights.
This is a sweeping decision by the Supreme Court to overturn the Chevron precedent.
What this does is it ends 40 years of regulating big business.
You hear about the justices making it literally legal to bribe politicians.
In a 6-3 opinion, the court ruled that gifts to public officials can only be considered illegal bribes if they're given before the official act.
It seems like every few months the Supreme Court makes it easier and easier to bribe government officials.
You even hear about the Supreme Court actually declaring that the president does not have to follow the law.
It's the first time the Supreme Court has ruled that former presidents can be shielded from criminal charges.
In every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law.
As you're doom scrolling, do you ever stop and ask, what the actual is going on? And how in God's name did we get here? Well, we have an answer for you. It wasn't a random coincidence, and it wasn't just by chance. What's happening right now is the culmination of a very deliberate and very secret scheme, executed by specific people with specific goals. I'm David Sirota. As a longtime journalist and author, I've spent decades working in and covering American politics. Our team of reporters at The Lever is about to expose the never-before-reported details of this plot in our upcoming new investigative podcast series, Master Plan.
They are actually trying to open our political world to right-wing dark money.
Something very weird is going on.
That doesn't fly. It's got to be money.
Where's all this money coming from?
We've spent 2 years reporting this story, so you're not going to want to miss it. Go to masterplanpod.com to sign up to be the first to get the series when it launches in August. You can also find the trailer and subscribe to the podcast feed right now by searching Master Plan in your podcast app.
Does anyone note those contradictions? Like, I can't imagine working for a pro-climate group and then sitting at a table with the American Gas Association. You know, maybe the crypto thing. I mean, crypto is bad for the environment too. But I mean, is anyone like you know, noticing and going, hey, this is kind of weird and bizarre, right? Or does everyone sort of buy into just the Comic-Con fantasy Disney world that is the convention, and it's like, hey, this is life, and you know, we're going to hear a bunch of fun speeches and listen to some music?
Yeah, I don't think there's any consciousness of it at all. In fact, at one of the events I was at, I said, look at this billboard of all the sponsors. And I mentioned like crypto and the Solar Energy Industry Association and the fossil fuel companies and climate. I said, how does this make any sense? And a couple of people I was with, they were like, wow, they're like, wow, I didn't really think about that. Right? It's just sort of part of the background. I said, I'm trying to, and on that example, I was saying, like, what is the vision here? Like, we're going to have more crypto that's solar powered crypto? Is that what we're talking? Because, right, like, but I don't think it's thought of that clearly.
Yeah.
I think it's like, these are the power players trying to, like, why are they sponsoring the events? Well, one, to get access, as we discussed, literally just straight up access in those suites at the convention or at these parties, but also as a branding exercise
to the donor and political class itself. They are basically saying to all of the attendees at the convention and to all the politicians and to all the political operatives here and the affiliated groups, those brands, when they see them at these different parties, they're saying, we are stakeholders in the Democratic Party, right? And I think that's a very important and powerful and insidious message.
Yeah.
It is basically corporate America saying we are part owners of this party, and it is the party saying we are happy to have them as part owners of our party.
You know, I was reading a really good article by Zach Carter on Slate, and I had actually talked to Zach earlier this week, and one of the things that he noticed is that within the same, almost breath, the same night, you have Gina Raimondo, former governor of Rhode Island, now a cabinet secretary, saying that, you know, we're anti-monopoly, while being one of the most pro-corporate politicians that had entered the administration. Then you have AOC saying we are fighting for the working people, but it's in the middle of this pit of just sheer corporate power. What do you make of that inherent contradiction? You know, like, am I being too cynical and kind of reading that as like, do they think we're dumb? Like, you're going to say this is the party of the working people while you're standing around a bunch of corporate lobbyists. But what have you made of that contradiction as you've been there?
Well, I think, look, first of all, I think there are many factions of the Democratic Party. So I do think when Bernie Sanders or AOC talks about this stuff, when we put it up against their record, I think they're pretty consistent, right? Just because the event is a corporate event, which it is. I mean, the Democratic National Convention is a corporate event. I don't even think that's in dispute. I mean, I think there's value in it. I think it's the delegates who come from all over the country who are really the grassroots warriors of the party. I think it's valuable to them in a good way, right? Meaning valuable at a grassroots level. But it is a corporate event. And I think that what some people try to do is use the platform to try to push the party this way or that. I think also, though, you're right. Like, there are politicians who are actively corporate politicians who are trying to gaslight the delegates and the party faithful and everyone watching on TV, trying to gaslight them into believing that these politicians are, well, as Kamala Harris's motto goes, that they're for the people. And I mean, one of the things that's been disturbing to me about this campaign so far is last night, and I'm talking to you on Thursday night, so on Wednesday night, there was this whole video production, for instance, about how Kamala Harris had really led the fight against Wall Street during and after the financial crisis and the foreclosure crisis, which is just, that's just false. It's a lie.
It is. It's a lie.
It's the opposite of the truth. I mean, yes, she participated in the national mortgage settlement, but to portray her as leading it, to portray her as really the vanguard of pushing for a tougher settlement, a crackdown on Wall Street, it's not only untrue, it's the opposite of the truth. And the thing that's bothersome about that is, it's one thing to exaggerate a good side of somebody's record a little bit, to really lean into it, spotlight it. That's politics.
Yeah.
It's another thing to take a piece of a politician's record that is their weak spot, that they should be embarrassed about, and then portray it as their strongest spot. That's a level of Orwellian dishonesty that is deeply problematic. And sure, will it work in the short term? Maybe. Does the average Democratic voter know or even care about the mortgage settlement as an example? Unfortunately, probably not.
Yeah.
But it is a deeply cynical tactic. And I think it tells us, frankly, how the Democratic Party bosses see their own voters. They see their own voters as being gullible. as not caring.
I think that what you're talking about is exactly what we were talking about with Jay Caspian Kang last week. This is part of the reason it's really important for the press, but really anyone, to probe and interrogate Kamala Harris's actual history as an elected official and a politician. And this is kind of the danger of running a vibes-based campaign and sort of buying into a vibes-based campaign. Because look, you and I, we work here at The Lever. We would love to see more of a crackdown on corporate power. We would love to see, politicians taking on bankers. But there has to be action with that. You can't just, do a fun TikTok video or make a great speech. And I think that's something that I'm hoping that's going to change as this election moves on. I know here we're going to, do a couple episodes looking at Kamala Harris's history. But I think what you raised right there, that contradiction, is exactly why we need to be probing Kamala Harris.
Well, 100%. But I do think there's a silver lining. I do think that the themes of this convention, even though it's dishonest, to say the least, to portray Kamala Harris as a tough on Wall Street crime kind of person, as dishonest as that is, it is an acknowledgement that those politics are popular, that the Democrats want that brand now.
Yes.
I mean, that may sound like an obvious thing for them to understand, but it wasn't that long ago that there was this very deep and intense ideological competition in the party between what used to be called the DLC, the corporate wing of the party, and the progressive wing of the party. And I think at least in terms of rhetoric and desired brand, that the progressive populist wing of the party has won the argument. That clearly even corporate Democrats, like, for instance, Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, has always been one of the most conservative, economically conservative members of the Democratic Party. If even she's talking, for instance, anti-monopoly at the Democratic Convention, it's an acknowledgement that the rhetorical debate about what kind of politics is popular, that debate is over.
Absolutely.
That the Democrats actually understand that they have to look like, at least aesthetically, in the optics, they have to look like populists. Now, where the rubber hits the road is what happens in those suites, those corporate suites that we talked about, right?
Yeah.
Because where the rubber hits the road is, will the brand, the populist brand, translate into actual policy?
Do you notice when you're going around like the floor, like, I believe you've been to DNCs in the past before, right?
Yes.
When you've been going around on the floor, because, I saw on Facebook, there are a couple people who from Massachusetts were showing the Massachusetts delegation. Those people tend to seem to come more from the grassroots. Does that feel different? Does that popular energy manifest from them? And is this a different feeling vibe? And I know I just ragged on talking about vibes, but I'm going to ask you, does the vibe, at least from the delegates and the kind of grassroots, really feel different from the conventions of the past?
No, it feels very similar to me, and I say that in a good way. I mean, I sat with the Colorado delegation for a while on the floor with the Colorado delegation, because I'm from Colorado. And, these are the rank and file. I mean, they're the elected officials too, but they're the rank and file people who, like, knock on doors and make phone calls. Right. And, like, this is a big event for them because it's a recognition of them and their hard work and their importance to the party. Because, again, while we talk about the corporate suites and the brands and the sort of corporate influence at the convention, the party also is recognizing that it needs foot soldiers, right? Yeah. I mean, this is as much a way to try to pump up the foot soldiers as anything else. And I think, like, talking to these delegates, I think they're excited. I mean, I think they're primarily excited that they believe that Donald Trump is not going to be president again.
Sure.
Or at least there's a better chance he's not going to be president than when Biden was the nominee. So I think that all of that part of the convention, that part is really authentic. It's real. It's not to be laughed at. It's not to be scoffed at. But clearly, the people who are on the floor of the convention, their interests are in conflict with the people up in the corporate suites. Yeah. And the elected officials move between both of those worlds. And the central question of the Democratic Party, really of all of politics, is which side are they on? And I don't think we have a fully clear answer on that. But I will also add one other point, that I have been pleasantly surprised that I thought the party, in its video messages, in its presentations, in its other keynote speeches, and in Kamala Harris's first inklings of policy, that they haven't been mealy-mouthed. They haven't been wishy-washy. I mean, they've been very limited in what they've put out there. But in what they've put out there, they've been more embracing of the populist line than I thought they were going to be. And I think that is mildly encouraging. Now, I will also say this. Talking to a number of good government advocacy groups, public interest advocacy groups, most of the people that I've been talking to at this convention, whether it's in the anti-monopoly world, in the labor world, or the like, they understand that the branding of the party, the branding of Harris right now, this early branding as a populist, that's an opportunity for them to try to hold the prospective White House, if Harris wins, hold them to those promises. That's the work they're going to need to do after the election. I think a lot of them understand that the rhetoric is merely an opportunity. It's not a guarantee.
At the top of the show, we had heard that you and David Dane, the executive editor of the American Prospect, you had a chance to go to sort of a press conference with a group of senators. I know you've been talking to other elected officials as you're out there. Who have you been talking to, and have any kind of stood out to you, and what have you been talking to them about?
Yeah, well, we got a chance to sit in on Senator Gary Peters, Senator Masto from Nevada, and Senator Warnock from Georgia, as they presented the electoral picture for the Senate Democrats. And the question that we asked was, the candidates are making all these promises. We're going to codify Roe. We're going to raise the minimum wage. We're going to do, expand health care. Are the candidates explicitly saying, these Senate candidates out in America, are they saying they're committed to ending the filibuster? Because the thing is that if you don't end the filibuster, none of these pledges will happen. I mean, that's just a fact of life. And Senator Masto from Nevada, she said, I never hear from, and our candidates never hear from voters asking whether we're going to end the filibuster.
But I can tell you in Nevada, is that what voters are asking Jackie Rosen or asked me? No. It is still the issues that matter to them are those kitchen table issues, affordable housing, access to quality health care, right? How do we reduce some of these costs? How do we keep our communities safe? What are we doing? Those are what I am hearing and heard in my reelect, and am hearing still now at the end of the day. The only other thing that our voters are talking about, because Donald Trump elevated it, was the border. When we had a solution to address some of the challenges that we saw at the border, and then Donald Trump came along and killed it and asked his Republican colleagues not to vote for it. That has elevated for voters in my state. Those are the conversations when I'm out. That's what, so I suspect that's what Jackie is hearing, and our electeds as well.
It's probably true that people aren't running up to senators saying, are you going to end the filibuster? People are running up to senators saying, are you going to raise my wages? Are you going to deal with climate change? Are you going to help improve the material conditions of our lives? But that answer that she gave was sort of cynical, because, yeah, of course, the average voter isn't asking you about the filibuster. But the filibuster is the obstacle to delivering on what you're promising.
Yeah, I mean, you can't kind of disentangle what the filibuster has done and the role that it's played without, as an isolation. The reason it's such a devious tactic is because of how much popular legislation that it has stalled.
I frankly think, my takeaway is that a lot of these candidates, Senate candidates, are probably nervous about saying they want to end the filibuster, because
it gives their opponent a chance to say, oh, look, in the swing state, they're going to end the filibuster and allow, if you're in a conservative swing state, allow Bernie Sanders' entire agenda to fly through the Senate, right? They'll paint you as some, lefty communist. And so I think a lot of but look, Chris Murphy from Connecticut, we also talked to him about this, and he essentially said, you're absolutely right. Like we won't be able to get our agenda done unless we deal with the filibuster.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. This episode was produced by me, Arjun Singh, with editing support from Joel Warner. Our theme music was composed by Nick Campbell. We'll be back next week with more episodes of Lever Time.